Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. What is the Academic Council for the United Nations System, commonly called ACUNS? What is ACUNS doing to help inform academics, policymakers, and the general public about various United Nations programs to promote world peace, as well as to enhance economic and social development? My guest today is going to bring us up to date on this very interesting organization. We'll be back in just a moment after this important message. Welcome back to our program. Today we're looking at ACUNS, the Academic Council for the United Nations System, and how it operates to help inform people about the various activities of the United Nations. My guest is an expert in this area. My guest today is Dr. Alistair Edgar. Dr. Edgar, a Canadian and British national, is the Executive Director of the Academic Council on the United Nations System. Dr. Edgar has a PhD in political science and international relations from Queen's University. He was a John M. Olin Doctoral Fellow in Economics and the National Security Center for International Affairs at Harvard University in 1992-93. Dr. Edgar, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thanks, Bill. I'm pleased to be here.
I appreciate you being with me. Let's start off with a very basic question about the Academic Council for the United Nations System, ACUNS. What is it? When was it formed? Why was it formed?
Well, it's our 25th anniversary year this year, so 25 years old. It's a professional association for scholars and practitioners, not just scholars and practitioners who are interested in the United Nations and in international organizations generally and problems of global governance, whether they be security, development, or other kinds of issues. And it promotes innovative research, writing, teaching, and dissemination of ideas about how to address problems of global governance.
Mm-hmm. Now, are you a membership organization? Do you have universities that are members, individuals perhaps are members?
Both. We have currently about 650 individual members of all types around the world and 60 institutions that are members, plus 4 liaison offices that are based here in New York, in Vienna, in Geneva, and in Delhi, India.
Now, what types of programs do you focus on? What areas? The United Nations is very broad. You have the humanitarian programs, the humanitarian social programs, you have the human rights, the General Assembly, the peacekeeping, peace and security. Yeah. Do you focus on all of that, or are there certain areas that are main areas of focus for you?
Well, really, we like the UN, we address a wide range of issues. So we'll have an annual meeting that may be addressing peace and security issues primarily, but then we'll have another program that may be addressing technical issues of development. So we really cover the whole range of what the United Nations does.
Mm-hmm. Now, if our viewers are interested, they can go to www.acuns.org, acuns.org, and get much more information about your very interesting organization and learn a lot about it. So yeah. I hope people will do that. Let's talk a little bit about ACUNS in general, and what are some of your plans for the future? Do you have plans to reach out to other universities or to interact with governments or the private sector, or do you have programs that are on the drawing board in this area?
We do. We have a range of different programs. Right now we're working with and developing better relationships with a number of American foundations, as well as some European foundations and some Asian foundations. So we're working on delivering programs that range again from peace and security to cultural dimensions of security sector reform, training, to water, environment, and health. Working with governments, working also with some university institutions and with private foundations.
Mm-hmm. Now, the United Nations was formed in 1945, And it really came out of a lot of activities that led up to that with the League of Nations and other activities. What were some of the major contributors to the founding of the United Nations?
Well, I think the major contributor to the founding of the United Nations was the experience of the disintegration and failure of the League of Nations, its predecessor. It was a difficult experience that people tried to work their way through, and learning what the League of Nations in many ways was an idealistic organization, and learning from some of the, if you want, mistakes that were made in assuming too much of what a purely legal framework or a largely legal framework could do for international relations.
Let's flash back to the late 30s, early 40s. And of course, we remember the horror, the devastation of World War II. We saw that Europe literally lay in ruins. You had countries destroying one another. Parts of Asia had been destroyed. It was just horrific, the devastation that had taken place. How did that play into the psyche and also into encouraging leaders of the world to come together who had major ideological differences? If you think about the old USSR and the US and the other players at that time, how powerful was that as far as bringing them together to kind of move them very quickly to develop an international organization to bring countries together?
I think it was critical, absolutely critical. I mean, the movement towards the creation of the United Nations began during the war. It was several years before 1945. You had the Alliance for a United Nations, and particularly the British and the American leaders, but also their allies and even Russia under Stalin, had learned that they needed to have some kind of a framework, something more practical, something that recognized power disparities, but they knew that they needed to have a framework to help them address issues of peace and security. We have to remember at that time that the world of independent states was a much smaller one than exists now. So many of the originally 50-plus states that were part of the United Nations in 1945 were actually allies of the West. But as you mentioned, you had a deep ideological divide that was increasingly emerging and came more to the fore, obviously, with the defeat of Germany and the end of the Second World War between East and West.
And that's something that is very interesting in that it was a very small number. I think, what, 51 countries, with Poland being involved in setting up the United Nations. And now today, the United Nations has 193 countries because a large number of those countries had been under colonial control, the British or the French or the Germans, whatever the case might be. And of course, you see a much larger, more diverse organization than was there in 1950. Now, you hold annual meetings, and I'll just pull one out of the air, the June 13th through the 15th, I think it was, meeting in New York City for your 25th anniversary. You focused on a variety of these. What were some of the themes that came out of your meeting to highlight what's going on at the United Nations?
Well, the title of this year's meeting was New Norms, New Actors, and New United Nations, with a question mark at the end. And what we wanted to try to explore, not necessarily define, but certainly try to explore, was the kinds of new ideas that were coming out. We've been looking at issues of the responsibility to protect, of forms of intervention into failed and failing states, and dealing with, identifying and dealing with new challenges around environmental sustainability and new forms of energy. So what kind of ideas, what kinds of sets of principles were emerging? So we wanted to look at those ideas or norms and then look at what actors exist and how they're trying to address those. And from those two parts, translate that into what does that mean for the United Nations? Are we looking at a whole new organization, or is it an organization that needs to tinker around the edges of itself?
Is there one answer to that? I know that UN reform is something that was really kicked off by, I guess, Secretary General Kofi Annan several years ago with a two-track approach to internal reform of the UN. And of course, Secretary General Ban Ki-moon has also moved in that direction to reform the UN. Are there certain things that could be done to help reform the United Nations Security Council or the General Assembly or whatever it may be to make it a more effective and a more efficient organization?
Well, effectiveness and efficiency aren't always
not
in parallel
that's
with
right.
each other.
They're not synonymous.
Yeah, I mean, Security Council reform is the perennial bugbear for the United Nations. And we need to remember that the UN has been reformed a couple of times. It's increased in number from 9 to 15. It has increased it's done internal reforms on openness and transparency. So the UN itself, the UN Security Council itself has changed, but India, Brazil, Japan, Germany, other countries that are rising, and some sets of interests as well as particular countries that are underrepresented, because this UN Security Council is still the Security Council of 30, 40 years ago. There are real issues that need to be addressed there. The General Assembly, one state, one vote, and universal membership, but there are concerns in there perhaps about some of the processes and the tendency to do block voting and the need to have the General Assembly address issues on the basis of their merits, not on the basis of ideological or other blocks. So there's a range of different ways that the UN, the major political organs of the UN, are always being looked at as improving both their efficiency and their effectiveness. In terms of the UN itself, again, like any bureaucracy, the UN is a remarkably small bureaucracy with a remarkably small main budget, but still there are always ways in which it can be reformed to make it less wasteful, more effective administratively, more effective on the ground as well.
And you talked about the blocks and the ideologies, for example. And if we think back during the Cold War, well, the UN was formed in 1945 and the Cold War started about 46 or before the ink dried on the UN Charter in San Francisco. And we saw that the Cold War was really fought in the Security Council. The Soviet Union, their allies went one way, the U.S., its allies went the other way, and not a lot was accomplished in the Security Council. You can probably count the successes on one hand, but really with the end of the Cold War, the rusting of the Iron Curtain, or however you want to put it, there really has been a lot of much more cooperative rather than confrontational interaction amongst the members.
Yeah, it opened up to some extent, at any rate, especially in the first 15 years with the end of the Cold War, with many former Soviet Union countries becoming new democracies, and with Russia at that time still, in a sense, trying to find its way, its own sets of new interests. I think in the last 5 years we have seen a little bit more of a hardening of the arteries in the Security Council again, as Russia under Putin has become more assertive of its own interests, and perhaps as Russia and China in some senses responded to the assertiveness of the American administrations in the last decade, and they've started to stake out space. And we're seeing some of that backlash now with Syria, where there's a need for some form of intervention, but national interests that have nothing to do with what's really going on the ground are stopping the Security Council from being able to move forward.
Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is an independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We'll be back in just a moment after this important message. Welcome back to our program. Today we're looking at the Academic Council for the United Nations System, commonly called ACUNS. And my guest today is a person who's very knowledgeable of this very interesting organization. My guest today is Dr. Alistair Edgar, who is the Executive Director of the Academic Council on the United Nations System. Dr. Edgar, we're talking about the United Nations and the Security Council, and of the 6 organs of the United Nations, the General Assembly, the Security Council, the Secretariat, the Trusteeship Council, the International, ECOSOC, the International Court, the World Court. The Security Council is by far the most powerful organ within the UN system. Why is it so powerful?
Well, it's the organ that is given the vested interest to deal with what remains the core function of the United Nations, dealing with peace and security issues. It's the organ that the major powers in 1945, and arguably still the major powers today, can exercise a veto power. They were given in recognition of their military power, their economic might, the right, the power, the authority to veto anything that the United Nations might be doing in peace and security issues and over issues indeed of United Nations reform. So they are the real power-wielding organizational body inside of the United Nations.
Now, when the UN Charter was signed in 1945, it was specific in some areas as far as laying out some parameters, but vague in other areas. But one noticeable exception that was not in there was about peacekeeping. And of course, we see today the peacekeeping is a major operation within the UN system. I'm guessing at this, probably 12–14% of the budget goes to peacekeeping, something like that. And of course, there are about 14 or 15 peacekeeping missions now. Why is peacekeeping so important?
Well, unfortunately, if you will, we have a lot of different countries that have internal conflicts taking place in them. Peacekeeping really grew up as a way to try to address conflicts in which the major powers could not become engaged, in which an American or a Russian or a Soviet back then engagement would in fact be counterproductive. So it's a way of stepping in between peaceful and being at war with each other. But it's a form of activity that is in fact bigger now than ever before. We've got crises in more places, unfortunately, that require more UN peacekeeping to step in to try to either stand between combatants or to try to enforce a peace on combatants who don't want that peace. So peacekeeping has actually changed a little bit as well as becoming bigger. It's become, in some senses, more Chapter 7 oriented, which means using force to enforce peace and not simply try to support countries that want peace.
And it was interesting that I guess the first peacekeeping mission was 1948. The UN, the truce supervision operation to monitor the Arab-Israeli peace accord at that time. And of course, today the UN, I think, has about 120,000 troops in the field in these 14 or 15 missions. But a myth that's out there, a lot of people think that the UN has this large standing army, but the UN really has no army. These 120,000 troops are, how do they get them?
It's voluntary contributions from countries. Essentially the UN, it is a wonderful myth that the UN has this army of soldiers and black helicopters somewhere. But for every mission, the UN has to go essentially cap in hand to its member states and ask them for troops. It's a significant problem for the United Nations. There are the major troop contributing countries for peacekeeping missions today are Bangladesh, Nepal, India, Pakistan, Nigeria, none of the developed world countries, if you want, the Western world countries with advanced militaries, with all their transportation capabilities and other things, for a variety of reasons. They're not interested or not willing to contribute. So the UN is constantly going cap in hand to its members. If the Security Council is going to give a mandate for a new peacekeeping mission, it's always a significant problem. Where can the UN get the troops if they need 10,000 or 15,000 troops and everything that goes with that? Where are they going to get it from? It's always an uphill battle.
And of course, that was one of the main reasons that tied into the Rwandan debacle that took place back in the mid-90s, I guess it was, when the UN Secretary General then, Boutros-Boutros-Ghali, had to go around literally asking for money from countries, and he couldn't raise the money because most countries did not want to get involved. And of course, there wasn't the political will to be involved in that particular civil war that was taking place at the time.
In the immediate aftermath of Somalia, the United States in particular was not interested in another African conflict. So there was no political will in Washington to engage, and the rest of the West would not engage without American leadership, and the capacity to intervene did not exist in other places. So yes, the genocide in Rwanda was allowed to unfold in front of our eyes as we watched it. And many people said that they didn't know what was going on, but everybody could see what was going on. The media could report what was going on, but nobody was interested in intervening there.
Now, the UN peacekeeping, this will be the last one on peacekeeping, but the countries, there are dozens of countries that contribute troops, and they have different levels of training. Some are very well trained, some may not be as well trained. Would it be a good idea for the United Nations to have like sort of a NATO type of arrangement where you brought all the troops together and had sort of a universal training program so that you could have everybody at the same level? You'd have people who were fluent in a particular language, whatever it might be, in a peacekeeping zone and that type of thing. Would that not make it a more effective operation?
It would make it a more effective operation. I think it's most unlikely to happen because countries are not going to be interested. The countries that could afford to provide the funding for that training aren't going to want to provide the funding for that training. The countries that will provide the troops can't provide the funding for that training. And there would, I think, in many cases be some kind of an opposition. Countries, states, governments are not willing, they're very leery, they're very cautious about giving the UN more power for a variety of different reasons, some good, some bad. But they don't want the UN to have a permanent capacity. They don't want the UN to have intelligence gathering capacities either. They're very, very guarded and very protective. And although it would make a lot of practical, pragmatic sense to have everybody trained up, it's extremely unlikely that the Americans, the Russians, the Chinese, the Japanese, others would agree to fund a training facility that would bring troops from different countries together and bring them up to a par. And of course you'd have to decide what the par is. Is the par American levels of professionalism or something that's a little bit better than, you know, ragtag? Where is the level going to be?
We were talking a moment ago about myths, and of course there are a lot of myths out there. You mentioned the black helicopters, which is total nonsense. It started with, I think, with the John Birch Society back in the 50s in the United States. People who truly did not like the UN. But there are so many other myths out there, but it's interesting, and you live in Canada, you have dual citizenship, Canadian, British citizenship, but in the United States, the polls show that the vast majority of the American public, the latest one was like 84%, 85% of the public support the U.S. being actively involved in the United Nations and working with other countries to deal with these problems, dealing with terrorism or to deal with whatever, the illegal flow of drugs or whatever the case might be. But you also find in this country, and maybe it's not the same in Canada, the majority of the people really don't understand the UN, and one of the reasons is the way the media cover it. As an academic, and you travel around the world, how do you see the various types of media covering UN activities?
It's a really mixed bag. There's very little, far too little, really good coverage of the UN. And good coverage of the UN does not mean being a friend of the UN.
No, not a flag waver.
Not a flag waver, not a cheerleader. There really isn't. And to some extent, one understands that journalists don't all want to specialize in the UN. They are going to move through in their careers. But there really isn't a professional core of journalists who around the world who give good media coverage to the UN. They want to look at a particular issue. They want to pick something that sells, something that grabs people's attention. And too often what it is blame the UN. And it sounds like an excuse that you're defending the UN when you say, for example, well, the UN is failing in Syria, when it's not the UN that's failing in Syria. It is a disagreement between the Russians and the Americans, etc. But there's a limited coverage, and different countries have different ways of looking at the UN. Some of them will see it as an American tool, which is a fascinating thing for me when I'm in one part of the world and they think the United Nations is a tool and an instrument of the UN because, for example, we're trying African warlords but not looking at other places. And then if you're in the United States or some other countries and they see the UN as a tool of this bloc or that bloc out there, or as anti-American in the United States for some people. There's a lot of misconceptions and a lot of poor reporting that are based on ideological preferences. And that feeds into the media. The media is funded by people. And those people want to sell a particular story through the media, and it's not always friendly to the UN.
And I think that's exactly what happened with Libya. The coverage of the UN operation in Libya was very limited. And of course, the UN was very involved in setting up the no-fly zone for NATO. The UN humanitarian affairs operations were on the ground. They were helping refugees. You had the UN Children's Fund, just on across the board. There was a lot of UN activity, but really the focal point was on the Security Council. That was where everybody wanted to talk about what was going on in Libya and other places. So, but anyway, it's a fascinating topic, and the Academic Council for the United Nations system is certainly a very interesting organization, and our viewers can go to www.acuns.org to get more information. But Dr. Alistair Edgar, I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us on today's Global Connections program.